incident. For example, a fellow is living in the big residential building, and the third floor, he noticed people get to his store, and thieves, and they park the car, he sees them getting to his store from the back door and about to steal a lot of stuff, and he gets very nervous and very angry, and he decided to do something unusual. He pulled out a large piece of iron, large like a pillar, and he opened his window and he threw that on the car, and as a result, it was early in the morning, he broke the front windshield, the front window of the car, make a huge noise, right? All the neighbors, everyone came out. The thieves ran away, they left the car, they left everything. And when it's all said and done, it turns that the car was stolen. And the problem, here's the problem. They find out, the police came and everything, they found out the owner of the car. And the owner of the car sued him, took him to the Beit Din, and he said, you broke my front window and windshield. And he said, well, the insurance will pay. And he said, the insurance will pay the lease price, but they don't pay the real price of the expenses in the car and everything. So now the question is, we go by the guy that said, look, the car was stolen anyway from you, and you tell me that the thieves in some ways they already purchased the car or owns the car by taking it, and in a way it's not in your domain what happened later. Or you said since he damaged his car and needs to pay. How that connected to our subject? Soon you see, we're going to discuss a disputation in regards to a payment of Ketubah. Meaning, we have this ongoing discussion of situation that Ketubah, meaning a marriage agreement between husband and wife, and part of the stipulation is he is responsible to release her from jail, release her from captivity, supported her, etc. But what happened if those conditions either not written or is no Ketubah there involved? If she was raped while she was in a captivity, while she was married to a Kohen, etc. So here we are, page 51b, 2 lines from the very bottom of the page. Kohenet ahadrinach limdinatech. The Mishnah tells us that if the husband was a Kohen, and since he was a Kohen, if his wife was raped, he can no longer remain in a relationship of husband and wife. So if he did not put in writing in the marriage agreement, in the Ketubah, that if you ran to captivity, I am responsible to pay the expenses and have you return to the place you came from, he still have the obligation to do that, because that's what we studied earlier. It's called T'nai Bet Din, a stipulation that the rabbinic court imposed even without writing. Let's make sure that we all understand that. We have a Torah obligation between husband and wife. The specification came from the rabbis, which we call the Ketubah, the marriage agreements. Part of that formulation, it's called T'nai Bet Din, a stipulation that comes from the rabbinic court, that some have sort of amendment to the original agreement between the two parties. Husband can come in and said, this was not part of the agreement. You zoom in and you could not find part of the contract that stipulates those expenses. We come up and said, since the formulation of marriage agreement come from the rabbinic court, therefore regardless, the Mishnah said, if it was written in the agreement or not, the husband is still obligated to pay those expenses. So now we have a discussion over this statement in the Mishnah, because we, Nashim, going to learn on page 100b, that even in a case that Kohen Gadol, the high priest, we all know the biblical prohibition for high priest to marry even a widow. So the scenario the Mishnah presents to us is a Kohen Gadol that violated the law and married a widow, which is part of what the Torah said in Leviticus 24 verse 11. Therefore, she's still entitled to receive the payment of the Ketubah agreement in a case he passed or in case he divorced her. The same applies to a regular Kohen that violated the law and married a divorcee. The Torah prohibited a Kohen to marry a divorcee, even a regular one. She still deserved to receive the payment of the Ketubah, even it was in a violation. So, therefore, the Gemara go further, which we're going to study on page 85, that is a discussion, is sort of disagreement in regard to those conditions and what exactly she entitled to when she departed from him. For example, when it's come to a marriage agreement between Kohen Gadol and a widow, she received those rights, but it's not the same as a regular manner of husband and wife that departed, such as the alimony, such as medical expenses and more. So here you see the discussion and disputations. Let's sharpen this point to make sure before we go further that we all understand. The Mishnah tells us that if a person have a marriage relation and he did not write a Ketubah, did not write a marriage agreement, or if the Ketubah did not have all those specifications, all those stipulations we discussed, still he obligated by the framework of the rabbinic ruling, rabbinic court that formulates the idea of Ketubah. So here is the beauty of Judaism. In Judaism, the moment you marry, you're responsible for her. Regardless if you like her or not, regardless if you wrote it in a marriage agreement or not, you are responsible to pay certain things, such as alimony, such as release her from jail. So for example, if you heard that she was taken to a jail and you're thinking, who knows what's happened with her, right? And you said that it's not in a marriage agreement, you still have the obligation to pay the expenses. If something happened to her, it's a huge medical expense, and something happened between you guys and you do not like her for some reason, and you said it's not written in the Ketubah, you still have the obligation to pay those expenses. That's the point. That's the discussion. Why? Because a person tried to get away from those payments. For example, if he's a Kohen and now it's an issue, she may be raped while she was there. So he said, wait, I can no longer live with her, even I wish to, because I'm a Kohen. So why should I bother to pay all those expenses? The Mishnah said, yes, you do have to pay the expenses, you do have to release her, you need to pay the travel expenses and have her return to the destination she came from. Why? Because that's called Tnai Bet Din. That's the stipulation the Bet Din put in that case. If it's a regular Israel, she can return as his wife because she was raped against her will. But if he's a Kohen, he needs to release her and return to the place that she came from. The whole concept of Almanah, the widow for Kohen Gadol, or Grusha to Kohen Idiot, a regular Kohen, even it is prohibited. Even the Torah said you cannot marry, right? There is a stipulation within the framework of the Ketubah that if they departed, she still part of him in a sense of the expense. So if she was captured, he needs to pay those expenses. That's the framework. Amar Abaye, Almana leKohen Gadol chayav lifdota. Again, it's a widow. It's a violation of Torah law. They married, even she is prohibited to marry a high priest. Later, while they are married, she went to captivity, a capture took her. So now the husband, who is the high priest, challenged his expense. He asking, why do I need? The whole marriage is in a way not totally legal, right? It's not that I marry her, no matter how I like her or not, I need to pay her. Now, since it was a violation, why do I need to pay for that? שאני קורא בה ובכהנת אהדרינך למדינתך. Since he is in a framework of that stipulation of the rabbinic court, he have to pay for all of that. And that's the beauty, that's the chidush, that he cannot in a way take advantage of situation that he originally violated the law. Okay, that's the framework of Abaye.
Okay.
52. ממזרת ונתינה לישראל אינו חייב לפדותה מפני שאני קורא ועוטבינך לי לאינטו. Part of the language in the Ketubah, it's written in Aramaic, but it said, you become my spouse, my wife. Okay? Now, if she was a mamzeret, illegitimate child, or netina, we explained many times, that netina is a child that came out of strong illicit violation of Torah law. For example, a relation within family, that is total violation of Torah laws by any means. So that prohibited child cannot marry to a regular Israel by Torah law. Since is no any string to that marriage by any means, in our simple language, the violation is so strong that you cannot recognize in any framework of Judaism, in any angle, you cannot recognize that as a marriage by any means. So therefore, he cannot fulfill the part that's written in Ketubah, ve'otvinach lach li le'intu, you become my wife. And therefore, if she ran to captivity, he does not have to pay the expense. So the beauty of that is he cannot fulfill that t'nai bedin. It's not in that umbrella, it's not in that framework. So it's a strongly prohibited to him to come in contact with her by any means. So therefore, he is free in that language, in that sense, for pay that expense. Rava disputed him. You see many times in the Talmud, disputation between Abaye and Rava, even they are best friends. Okay? So Rava said that when it's a violation, it's a violation, and therefore he's not obligated to pay. Rava Amar, this is the general principle of a wife of Kohen. Kol she'isur shivya gorem la. As long as the idea of being in captivity, that caused her to be prohibited to her husband, since she was raped, and the moment that happened, she can no longer return to the Kohen, to the husband. Chayav lifdota. He needs to pay the expenses because otherwise she's totally stuck. Isur davar acher gorem la eino chayav lifdota, which means is no difference between Israel and Kohen in those stipulation of Ketubah. The husband needs to pay the expense of releasing her, and even it's written or not written in a Ketubah that if you turn to captivity, I have to pay the expenses. Basically, when you're writing the Ketubah, you're writing a general framework. So many scenarios can happen in the journey of marriage that you cannot cover all the nuances that things happen. So the general is, the rabbis come and instituted the principle that even a wife of Kohen should not lose the right of being released in a case of crisis. So the Rabbah said, look, his obligation is only if the original marriage was legitimate. But if the startup of that union was not legal, therefore all the consequences is not part of his responsibility. You cannot take the law and violated it and later on said that, okay, crisis occurred, he is responsible. So, versus Kohen Gadol that marry a widow, she is prohibited to him even without being in captivity, so he is not have the obligation to release her, the same way as the regular Israel, who is in violation, did not have the obligation to release her. So you see a huge difference in a mindset of this union between Abaye and Rabbah. Now, the Gemara said, okay, if that's the case, we need to juxtapose that to another Tanaic disputation. You have to remember the framework of Talmud, which we always said. We have the early part of the Mishnah, which is the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, which called Tanaim. That's the early rabbis, and you have disputation, Machloket Tanaim, that's earlier. And you have Amoraim. Amoraim is the rabbis that we now discuss that live in the time of the Talmud, which is the 3rd, the 4th century. Okay? So now, since we see here Amoraic disputation, right, we think that we can go backward and juxtapose this disputation to the early disputation between Tanaim. Okay? Leima ketanai. We may say that it's matched something that we already learned earlier, that is disputation between the Tanaim. Hamadir et ishto. Listen to a scenario that we feel is the same story. A husband make a decision that he doesn't want anything to do with his wife. For example, he have all kind of things that he's quote unquote his, and he doesn't want her to be involved with anything that it's his, right? For example, he said one of the 3 obligations you have to cohabitate with her, and he decided I'm going to a different room to sleep. I don't want to do anything with her, all right? Or I don't want to talk to her, or I don't want her to be involved with part of my business, etc., etc. So they said, then what happened is, the Gemara tells us on page 70, which we're going to study, that the Beit Din must convince him to divorce her. They can no longer stay under one roof in marriage in such an unhappy relationship. Then they said, Ven Ishbet. If unfortunately during that time of crisis in the house she ran to captivity, now you see an early disputation between 2 rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, even he made that vow, and that vow caused him to divorce her, and now it's a process of us convincing him to depart from her, still podeh, he's still obligated to pay the expenses of what? Of releasing her from captivity, and after he paid the expense and release her, then he needs to divorce her, venoten la ketubata. He needs to pay the amount of money that he commit himself in the ketubah. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, he goes different direction. He says no, since originally was this type of vow that he doesn't want to do anything with her, right? So first he needs to divorce her. Noten la ketubata. He paid the expenses that he committed himself originally in the Ketubah, but then ve'eino podeh. He doesn't need to pay anymore the expenses of releasing her from captivity. In some way, you can go to something we discussed yesterday, the federal law, that's saying that you go by the day of divorce in all the activities that happen between the 2 parties, which means if, for example, he produce a new product or make some money or anything that involve while they are still considering married, she deserves to get a half, even they are physically departed from each other. So it's a big discussion in federal law when you have a situation like they are separated and at the time of the separation, while the process of divorce, he make some new money, new investment, new things. If she entitled law, in general speaking, federal law said that as long as they're not granted a total divorce by the court, she still deserves to get half of whatever income he brought and vice versa. Correct? So now we try to match it.
So even though the marriage between a Yisrael and a mamzeret or a netuna is forbidden.
Correct.
But if they do get married, the ketubah is still valid.
Who told you that?
Well, this is what I'm reading.
No.
Well, but okay. So when they say here is if
Depends by Abaye or by Rava.
well, that's what I'm trying to understand, because I mean, just going back to the beginning of the page, it's saying that if an ordinary Jew is married to a netina or a mamzeret, he's responsible for, he's obligated to ransom her.
Okay. Here we explain that there's a difference between the school of thought of Abaye and Rava.
That, yeah.
One said,
but is that
even it was in a violation, he still need to pay.
So is that the dispute between them, is whether the ketubah is actually valid or not because of the forbidden marriage? Is that what the dispute is?
Okay. It's much deeper. It's not just the ketubah. If that type of relationship, it's total illicit relationship.
Right, it's a forbidden relationship.
So therefore, we don't care what happened, and he's not responsible for anything, period. Or we said...
According to whose view?
What?
According to whose view?
That's Rava.
Okay.
According to Abaye, he said, since they quote-unquote together, how do you say it, common wife or whatever you call
common law marriage, yeah.
Yes, so therefore, he is obligated. That's the mindset, okay? Now,
so Abaye is essentially then saying that the ketubah is valid, even though he's not?
He doesn't say that the ketubah is valid, but he recognized the fact. I'm sorry to use this example, but I'm just using it for you guys to understand. Imagine in our framework of the traditional Orthodox situation, you have a couple that come before us and they marry by non-Orthodox rabbi. So you have a situation by many that you require them to remarry. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they marry by non-Orthodox created the situation that we challenge that marriage. Mm-hmm. Because the whole idea of marriage, for example, has to be in a framework of traditional Judaism. So for example, if it wasn't kosher Eidim, if it wasn't kosher Ketubah, etc., if it's made doing Shabbat, if it's made in a violation of Torah laws, we, meaning the traditional rabbis, come in and said, hey, we challenge that marriage. Now,
does he have to give a get?
No, so the big question is,
okay.
You have to, now, what do you do with the children? Right? It's a big discussion, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein deal with that, etc. But back to our subject, we try to juxtapose two disputations. So we go back now to the issue of a husband that prohibited his wife to him, that in a very heavy, unhappy marriage, right? And he basically departed totally from her. They hardly talk to each other. They're not together, etc. Now, during that process of crisis in their relationship, she turned to captivity. Here you see a disputation since we already have several court sessions and we try to convince him to give her a get, and he's in a process to hopefully solve and departed between them, if he needs to first pay the expenses and then give her a get and the ketubah, or he needs to originally, the way that he commit himself, divorce her, give a ketubah, and no longer obligated to release her from captivity. That's the disputation between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Yes?
I got a question, Rabbi. If a person married, his marriage is not by traditional Judaism,
yes,
and they have children, or you treat their children, are they considered Jew?
Okay, so Rabbi Moshe Feinstein have a big response over that. And it's, by all means, it's a very, very painful, long subject. In very short, each case it's different. You cannot make a general statement. You need to come before a prominent Orthodox rabbi, and that rabbi need to determine what to do and how to do this, because it's so complicated and it's so individual. You have to remember, for example, who is the rabbi that married them? What exactly that rabbi did in a form of marriage? What type of Ketubah he used? What type of witnesses he used? Okay? What exactly happened in that marriage? Is that marriage happened during the week or during Shabbat? Is that marriage happened with the witnesses that are gamblers, criminals, or you have to ask so many questions. The investigation has to be so serious that eventually you reach a point that most probably you need to remarry them, and then you enter the question how you treated those children. So in very short, each case it's different. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay? Next. So here we have this disputation between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. So we said, Amar Rabbi Natan, Sha'alti et Somchus, I asked this great Rabbi Somchus, She'amar Rabbi Yoshua, Noten la ktubta ve'eno podeh, when Rabbi Yoshua said, hey, originally speaking, he made a decision to depart, that he doesn't do anything with her, and he said, we go by that statement that happened long ago, and therefore he needs to give her the money of Ketubah, and he's no longer responsible to release her. Is that means specifically Shehedira ulvasof nishbet? Is that happen if we talk about specific case that he clearly come out of his mouth that he prohibited anything to do with her, and then after they are totally departed, then she is kept rent to captivity, or beshenishbet ulvasof edira. And I wish to have more time, but in my book on Rashi, I elaborate on this case, because Rashi here said, Klomar o afilu shenishbet ulvasof edira. So Rashi have an issue here, if this guy taking advantage of a situation, in other words, is it a long of strong like-dislike, like-dislike, hate-love relationship between the two. Okay? And then he is now in a situation that, they took her to captivity, now I make up my mind, I talk with my mother, right? I talk with my sisters, and they all told me this is my opportunity to get rid of her, right? I'm just give you a scenario. So Rashi have an issue here. What exactly the Gemara said, I elaborate in my book. But anyway, the point here, we ask a question, is that like the straw that broke the camel in their relationship, and he just make a decision because of that? And basically, the problem is he is a sneaky guy. In other words, he tried to run away from payment by taking advantage of her being in captive, right? So he's like a cruel guy, right? So do we go along with that idea or not? You see, the rabbis are not stupid, right? They want to do what is right, and they want to protect her, right? V'amar li, Sumchus respond to me and said, Lo shamati, I did not hear this ruling from my teachers. V'nir'im dvarim, it's appear rationally what Rabbi Yoshua said, shehedira ulvasof nishbeh. If the relationship was terrible and they separated and he made a decision that he wants to depart from her, and then she went to captivity, then I understand what Rabbi Yoshua said, that let him divorce her and he's not obligated to pay the expenses. The iyamar nishbet ulvasof edira. But if you tell me that first she was taken to captivity and he subsequently vowed that she may not derive benefit from him, right? The husband might come to engage in very sneaky, tricky way to get rid of his obligation to pay the expenses, right? So my love, kemadir eshet kohen kamiflige. Again, we don't have a time, but in the Rashi here, Rashi said that hacha b'ma'askiran is a two-time klomar. Again, there's no time for that, but it's basically the whole Rashi issue here is what exactly the case of the relationship, what exactly happened between the two. Rashi tried to bring here two different avenues of the scenarios, and we want to get to the bottom in our examination if this man just tried to run away from his obligation and playing very sneaky or not. Okay? Abaye de'amar k'Rabbi Eliezer v'Rava k'Rabbi Yoshua. Now, remember we said we try to juxtapose, compare the disputation we have here between the Amoraim goes back to disputation between the Tanaim that have the similar result, and we said this is nothing new, it's already discussed earlier. How? Because if you go that Abaye, who said that Kohen Gadol that marry a widow and she's went to captivity, he needs to pay the expenses of releasing her, he matched the view of Rabbi Eliezer that said that if Kohen make a decision that he's no longer wants to have his wife benefit from his belonging, and then she went to captivity, he is still obligated to pay the expense of releasing her. And Rava is the other way around, the Amar Rabbi Yoshua, that said no. The moment he decided to depart from her, he just need to pay her the expenses of the get and it's over. So the Gemara said, "No, you cannot say that. Hacha b'ma yaskinan kegon shenadra ihi v'kiyem lahu." Here is the opposite. She is so sick of him that she make a decision that she doesn't want anything to do with him, and he goes along with her decision. The Torah give the husband the right to abrogate it, to annul his wife's vow. For example, someone knocked the door and she commit herself to give X amount of money, and he come in and he said, "You commit yourself without my consent, and this is money that we have together." Okay, so he basically can abrogate her commitment as a husband. But if it's something that she, for example, she committed herself inui nefesh, that this food I don't want to eat, or she committed herself not to have any relation with him. So if the husband, the Torah said, was acquiesce, which means he was quiet, he did not say anything, it's totally display equanimity. The Torah said in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 30, he is right to annul that vow. So, therefore, in this case, she make that vow, he goes along with that, so therefore, he does not need to pay for the expenses of releasing her from captivity. There is a book called Or Sameach, very important rabbinic, halachic book. So he asked a question, what exactly the statement in the Ketubah, V'otivi le'intu. It means, okay, he is obligated to release her, but he's now in a situation, in regular Israel, that he can divorce her if he wish to. So the Or Sameach holds something very interesting. He said that he can be with her for one time and then he can divorce her. So he have this mindset that the husband can exercise his right to unite with her, but if he noticed that she changed or things change since that traumatic incident, he's still we cannot force them to stay together any longer. There's a very big ma'alach in Or Sameach. Anyway, back to our subject. So Rabbi Eliezer Savar, hu noten etzba ben shinea. This is for sure euphemism. He said that he put a finger between her teeth, which means he is responsible for her to be bite, which means by fulfilling her vow, he caused her that she is prohibited to derive any benefit from him by her making that statement, and therefore he is obligated to pay the expenses of releasing her from captivity, even we know clearly that the end of that relationship will be a divorce and she will not return to him. Rabbi Yoshua Savar, he natna etzba ben shinea. Rabbi Yoshua Savar, Yoshua hold that she caused this bite to herself, which means she is responsible for the vow because she is the one who initially pronounced it. So therefore, she caused him to stay away from the condition of the Ketubah, ve'otivni lich le'intu, and therefore he is exempt from paying the expenses of releasing her from captivity. So there is a book called Chelkat Mechokek that he have a big discussion over a wife of Kohen, that she was raped while she was in a captivity, and later on she continued with the relation with the captor while she was consent, which again, originally speaking, was a rape, and then later on the relationship turned to be a normal relation. So Chelkat Mechokek hold that when it's all said and done, since he originally, the husband, was obligated to pay the expenses of releasing her from jail, even later on zinta beratzon, which means later on she basically already get along with that relations, he still needs to pay the expenses. Not everyone agree with that. If you remember, in the introduction we talk about a guy that saw a thieves and he throws something on the windshield. You remember that case? So the rabbi's rules in that case that he is still responsible to pay for that windshield. You tell me, but the car was stolen, etc., etc. But in a sense, in some ways, that's the mindset of the Chelkat Mechokek, that he basically hold, since originally she was raped and originally he was obligated to release her, even things turn sour later on, he's still under that commitment. Okay? So here the Gemara rejected that point, and they said, "Ihi natna etzba ben shinea," which again is euphemism. If she's the cause to do what? She put the finger between her teeth, right? Which means that she is the one who is responsible for that vow. Ketubah my avidita. So the marriage contract, what is doing here? Why must he pay by marrying contract if it is her fault that they cannot remain married? The two is another issue here we can challenge. Amar Rabbi Natan sha'alti et Somchus. Somchus was the very high scholar, authority, right? Kshamar Rabbi Yoshua, when Rabbi Yoshua said that when the husband divorced her, noten la ktubta ve'eino podeh, he needs to pay the Ketubah expenses, but he is not obligated to pay the expense of release her from captivity. He meant to say kshehedira ulvasof nishbet. If it means, you remember the case that first he make a decision that he have nothing to do with her, he prohibited her to derive benefit from him, and then later on she went to captivity. Only in this case he is no longer obligated to release her from captivity. Or may we said opposite. Beshenishbet. First, originally, she went to captivity, and he in his heart already looking around to all kind of other options. Right, Gilbert? And then what happened is, now, okay, she's in a captivity, forget it. Ulvasof edira. So he hold that anyway, he's exempt from paying the expenses. Why? Because this guy, remember him, he's a tricky guy. He is sneaky. He, in his deep heart of hearts, wants to get rid of her. He is taking advantage of the fact that she is in captivity. Amar Sumchu said to me, Lo shamati. I did not, remember he said, I never heard that rule from my teachers. Ve'i nadra ihi, and you remember the opposite way case, which is if she said that she is prohibited herself from anything to do with him, and the husband get along with her statement, Mali hedira ulvasof nishbet, Mali nishbet ulvasof hedira. What's the difference if she is the one who make that statement, or he want the man to make the statement? That Rabbi Natan have an issue, a quandary with that, because it's obvious that if first she went to captivity and then she make that decision to exempt her husband from paying the expenses, so for sure he's exempt by the other way around, that he first make a decision to depart from her and then she ran to captivity. Because it's all started with that manner of vow, we should not concern that maybe the husband did it in order to circumvent the system and exempt himself from paying the expenses. The beauty of this discussion, by the way, is when you talk to erudite attorney and they just give you the final verdicts, right? You sometimes ask how they get to that point. And they can tell you that sometimes it's months and months of court discussions of a process, of a litigation process. So here you get to the mindset of the rabbis when people come before us, before the rabbinic court with disputation, we need to reach in the cross-examination, the bottom line of all this process of litigation, to know clearly what's the cause of the causes that things happen. So you see those scenarios, hypothetical scenarios that we are dealing here, between pronunciation of one spouse to the others, some type of crack in the relationships, captivity, is all kind of cases. We need to get the bottom line of what's happening here and how this match the Torah obligation of a husband who commit himself in the because usually that's the case. They engage, they married, he commit himself to endless money, to everything in the world, everything and anything, it's yours, right? And then all of a sudden when things turn sour, then he tried to back out and change. So here we are. I remember one time, Daddy, my father, God bless him, for many years, I used to go with him as a kid, see him officiating weddings. Sometimes you have 2 and even 3 weddings a night. I remember Daddy sitting with so many times husband, especially Georgian, Gruzinian, and they commit themselves in those years for million shekel, who knows. And Dad tried to say to the husband, be rational. Just give him a number, real number. In those years, 10,000 shekel, 50,000 shekel. Don't give me a 10 million shekel, And not always he was successful because we as a rabbi always thinking 2 steps ahead. One of the reasons, as you know me, I'm very careful with conversion. And very rarely you see me involved with this. It's because we're thinking 2 steps ahead. What happens if a crack happens between them, and then the children suffer, and other people suffer, and then it's a lot. We are just trying to think 2 steps ahead, and that's the reason we have all those discussions. Ela leolam. So here we understand adra hihu, which is the husband pronounced unequivocally, clearly it's come out of his mouth that she will not derive any benefit from him. Abaye metaretz leta'amei. Abaye reconcile, explain according to his view. Verava metaretz leta'amei. So it means that this disputation is not depend upon the original Tanaic disputation. Why? Because each of them agree upon that when it's come to a widow that married to a Kohen Gadol, and here the Gemara elaborates on that. Abaye leta'amei. Abaye explained his view. Almana le Kohen Gadol kule alma lo pligi. Everyone agrees that if you have a widow that violated the Torah law by marrying a high priest, the chayav livdota, regardless if he married and he put a stipulation with that marriage or not, we call it ve'adran lemdinatach. That's the Mishna said, which means even originally or at the end he needs to pay the expense of releasing her and let her return to the domain that she came from. It's regardless if that manner of separation come out of the stipulation of the get of the Ketubah. Mamzeret untina l'Israel kule alma lo pligi. If it was Israel, regular Israel, who marry either mamzeret or netina, both are total prohibited. Remember, we talk about illicit relation that produce a child. For example, relation within family, immediate family, that produce an illegitimate child. So even Israel is prohibited to that. So everyone agreed that no chayav livdota, that the marriage by any rabbi, by anyone, said that it's illegitimate marriage. Everyone agrees. So therefore, you cannot go by this line within the Ketubah that said ve'otvina lach le'intu, that you become my wife, not in the original condition, not at the end of condition. Therefore, he never commit himself to release her from captivity. So the condition was not there, and therefore, it's nothing there. You see, my dear friends, why the Gemara said, remember we mentioned that kol she'eno baki betiv gitin v'kiddushin al yehi lo esek imahem. The Gemara warned the rabbis, if you are not 100% familiar with all the nuances of marriage, don't get involved. You're touching fire. And that's the big to-do with, you hear all the times with the rabbis, especially in Israel, over marriages that made outside of Israel, that they challenge that and they don't recognize that. You see why? Because you see, my dear friends, how complicated and details involved with every single word that it's written there, and how far we go with those obligations, right? For example, the line "Ve'otvina lach li le'intu," that this is an Aramaic. First, the rabbis need to understand, right? What is written there. But beside, and especially there has to be Orthodox Ketubah, right?
Yeah,
but I know, Elliot. I know what you're going to say.
I know what you're going to say. They
right,
Kesubos,
right.
They may have a Kesubah by another movement.
Right.
They may change words, or who knows why.
That you become my wife. That you become my wife. She cannot become your wife because she's illegitimate person, right? So if she is out of illicit relation child, and she's prohibited to you at the first place, this condition, this ketubah is not legitimate by any form, right?
One of these rabbis that they use this.
Let's not go there. Let's not go there.
It makes a marriage no good.
I know. Madir Eshet Kohen, if Kohen prohibited his wife from the wife benefit, name kule alma lo pligi, dechayav livdota. And everyone agreed that he needs to release her from captivity. The Hainu, which means this match to whom, Almana le Kohen Gadol, a widow that married a high priest, that he is obligated to release her, even it applies to that case, Va'adrinan lemdinatech, that I have to pay the expense of you coming out of jail and go to a place that you came from. So that's according to Abaye, even she can no longer return to him, to that marriage relations, still was not release him from his obligation to pay that expense. Keep the big disputation between the Tanaim is what? Bemadir Eshet Israel. Here is a case of regular Israel who vows that his wife, which means the wife of regular Israel, may not derive benefit from him. Now, Rabbi Eliezer Azil Batar Me'ikara, Rabbi Yoshua Azil Batar Desov. Rabbi Eliezer followed the original idea that when the marriage contract was written, so since at the time he could restore her to be his wife, the obligation he took upon himself to redeem her from captivity remained in effect despite the fact that he can no longer do so due to the vow. And Rabbi Yoshua go by the last part of that condition, which is after the time of fulfillment. We said since meanwhile he prohibit her to be with him, so she can no longer return to him as a wife. So therefore, he is free from the obligation of releasing her. Meaning what he said: pay her for the Ketubah, divorce her, pay her for the Ketubah expenses, and goodbye. The rest, if she needs to be released, she needs to use the money that she gets from the Ketubah. רבה בתרץ לטעמי, אלמנה לכהן גדול, ממזרת ונתונה לישראל, כולי עלמא לא פליגי, דאינו חייב לפדותה. In such a level of violation, everyone agrees that he's not obligated to release her. כי פליגי במדיר בין אשת כהן ובין אשת ישראל. We have the disputation in a case that who vowed that his wife, the wife of the Israel, may not derive benefit from him. And here you see the Baal Madir Ishto ben Eshet Kohen u ben Eshet Israel, right? Regardless, Rabbi Eliezer Azil Batar Me'ikara, Rabbi Yoshua Azal Batar Desov. So as we said, Rabbi Eliezer goes by the original, the time of the get married, as we explained earlier. Rabbi Yoshua go by the end, which means he holds that since he cannot fulfill his obligations to restore her as his wife, because she was in a captivity, he is entirely exempt from redeeming her. Now, the Mishnah tells us, Nishbet chayav lifdota, that if she was taken to captivity, her husband is obligated to redeem her, tanu rabanan. Nishbet b'chaye ba'ala v'achar kach met ba'ala. If she was taken to captivity, the husband was still around, and then he passed away before he redeemed her. So the question is, hikir ba'ala, if the husband was informed that she is in a captivity, so he is already retroactively obligated to release her while he was around, alive. Yorshim chayavim livdota, the heir, the inheritors, needs to pay the expenses from the estate of the late father for her to be out of captivity. Lo ikir ba'ala, en yorshim chayavim livdota. But if the husband is not informed of all of that until he passed away, which means he's not commit himself more than the original commitment of the Ketubah to redeem her from captivity, so the inheritors do not have the obligation to pay the expenses of releasing her from the jail, from the captivity. So Levi Savar, by the way, that's real important halachot. Very painful, right? But it's halachot, it happens. Usually the children, especially if it's the second marriage or stepchildren, etc., they have a estate, and then it's a big to-do over that, because sometimes it's such a hatred and bigotry between them, so they go out of principle not to pay, etc. Levi, but we're not a practical halacha yet. Levi savar lemevad uvda chiha matnita. Levi was a giant rabbi, so he wants to rule a halacha, practical halacha, following this braita, and he wants to force the heirs to pay for all the expenses, because the late husband already knew when he was alive that she was in jail, right? Amar le Rav challenged that. Amar Habibi. You know what is Habibi? Habibi is the Sephardic way, right? You know the song Habibi Ya Habibi, right? Remember Mayan used to sing it. Anyway, that's applied to my uncle. Rabbi Chia was a giant sage, and he was uncle of Rav. And Aruch said that it's like a sign of likeness, right? Habibi, like my dear whatever, my dear not friend, but my dear beloved, right?
My sweet.
All right, my sweet. Let hilcheta ki hamatnita. Ela kiha detanya nishbet lachar mitat bala. If she was taken to captivity after the husband passed away, en haitomin chayavin lifdota. The orphans are not obligated to pay the expenses of releasing her from jail. Velo od, and furthermore, ela afilu nishbet bechayei bala. Even she was taken to captivity while the husband was still around. Ve'achar kach met bala, and then the husband passed. En haitumim chayavim livdota. The orphans doesn't need to pay the expense of releasing her. Ve'otiva leintu. Here, the last part of that stipulation of the Ketubah said that I return you as my wife. Since he's gone, he passed away, so it's a different story. Now, regardless to the way we will take it anyway, the heir, the inheritance. Good morning, Judge Lerner. How are you?
Fine.
Our honorable judge.
Yeah.
You have a yortzeit today, right?
Yortzeit, yes. I
Very
didn't make it last night. I had to go somewhere.
All right. We talked about litigation this morning.
Oh, well, listen.
So they said that the heir doesn't need to pay the expenses of releaser. Why? Because he's no longer among the living, and she cannot return to him to be his wife. So just let's finish that part. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis teach us in a braita. Nishbet v'mvakshim mimeno ad asara bedamea, which means this is a situation, the husband and wife, she ran to jail or the captivity, and the people there want him to pay certain amount of money to release her. Now the problem is, here he needs to pay, but sometimes, let's trace a situation that she is a drug addict, or she is a thief, or who knows what. So, בפעם הראשונה פודה. First time she went to captivity, right? He needs to pay the expenses. Even they overprice those people, right? מכאן ואילך, רצה פודה, רצה אינו פודה. If it's the second time, you have the option to pay or not to pay. Even, Rashi said the chidush here, even they ask not exaggerated price, just the real price, right? The normal quote-unquote price, he is not obligated to do that, only one time. Tosfot said further that since he did it one time, he's not obligated to pay anything, period. He did it once, and that's it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel challenged that, and he says, 52b, אין פודין את השבויים יותר על כדי דמיהם. The idea is, even we're speaking about the first time, one may not ransom captives more than their value. Why? They said, מפני תיקון העולם, the benefit of society. So there are several avenues to understand what's the reason why we do not pay more than the normal values. Number one, it was those days of persecutions the people used to take other people and put them in a captivity and ask for money. So it turns that they basically ask sometimes exuberant amount of money, and the rabbi said there is a discussion in Tractate Gittin, page 45, if it's just because to avoid abuse, in a sense that the captor will ask money in order to make money over our people, or because to avoid people to reach poverty, which is you impose upon the community, because constantly you take people and you put them in the position of captivity and you want money. So if the community keep doing that, it turn the level of poverty. So there's a discussion in the code in Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah 252, how far you go with that. So individual, for example, if it's a wealthy person wants to redeem his relatives and wants to pay a crazy amount of money, usually you go along. Some rabbis are not happy with that. Some rabbis put the restrictions on that because they fear that the captor will misconstrue the idea of wealth. You know, these famous anti-Jewish sentiments that said, if you're Jewish, you're rich, right? I can show you tons of Jews who live in the Lower East Side, New York, that they're very poor, and I can show you a lot of poverty of Jewish community worldwide. But it's kind of a perception or stigma that some people have. So this is the captor who taking some people and wanted in exchange money. So that's the idea. Now, here we're talking about husband and wife. And again, the issue is that when he commit himself at the time of the marriage, that included captivity. She is now in captivity or in a jail, etc. He needs to pay that expense. The question is, we differentiate between first time and the other times. So if the husband come to redeem his wife first time, that as we explained earlier, he is obligated, he have to pay only the quote-unquote market value and not more than that. That's the way Tosfot and Maharsha tells us. The Shita Mekubetzet and also the Ritva have the issue with that. They try to base it on the Even HaEzer 78. The idea is that if you tell me Ishto Kegufo Dame, which means the wife is considered part of your meaning your body, and people for themselves do a lot of things. How many times you're exposed to people who said, well, they don't have money for dues, they don't have money to pay things. All of a sudden, when it's come to themselves, they do have money. You know what I'm talking about. If it's a medical expense, if it's a dentist, they have money. I'm not talking about people who said, I can't pay dues, and they end up buying a yacht for $100,000 or going to a vacation to Alaska twice a year. I'm talking about people who even for medical expenses, they do have the money to pay medical expenses, but it's a matter of priority. So since you tell me that the wife considering part of a husband, so he can come and say, well, for myself, I pay any amount. So that's the big debate here, how far you go. In general, we have the statement that even the first time, one may not ransom captives for more than the value for the benefit of society. So the Rashi said, so the kidnappers will not become tempted to demand exorbitant ransoms of money, because then it can have a terrible consequences. So habikdeida mehem podim. So which means the husband is obligated to pay the expense of taking his wife from jail, from captivity, if it's the amount that, again, the market value. Af al gav defir kona yoter al ktubata. What happened is, in reality, that Rabban Shimon Gamliel tells us that you have a Ketubah, you have an amount of money that he commit himself. Now the expenses exceeded more than that. So if they ask the market value and it's part of the amount that he commit himself in Ketubah, so it's not a question. But if the amount they're asking exceeded more than the amount that he commits himself, so that's the big idea, the big chidush, that he still needs to pay that expense. Veramini. So the rabbis bring a contradiction to this statement of Rabban Gamliel from different beraita, which is נשבט והיו מבקשים ממנו עד 10 בכתובתה. If she ran to captivity and the capture, they demand from the husband 10 times the value of her ketubah. So unfortunately it happens. How many times we read stories about Nazis that wants a certain amount of money to let go some prisoners, etc. It happens unfortunately many times in our history. So anyway, so he needs to go that value, mikan va'elach, if it happens again, which means it reoccur, that they took her again, which means these people take money once, and then either they like the idea to take advantage or other reasons, she's again, maybe it's her fault, anyway. So here we said ratza podeh, ratza eno podeh, which means here, since he did it already once, you cannot demand from a husband to pay more than one time. So if she ends up more than one time, let's trace just a different scenario, but to get to the point, right? If she's a drug addict, God forbid, she's an alcoholic, or all kind of things, she ends up in jail, right? So you ask him to pay for her one time, but more than one time, you cannot demand him to pay that expense, okay? Meaning, the rabbis here said that we leave it for your decision, for the husband's decision, to make up your minds. You know, sometimes you should know in the quote-unquote democratic rabbinic mindset view, we have some situation that we don't rule. You leave it for the person's decisions. Because we don't want him to say, in some sense, that we force him to poverty, or we force him to pay something that in his heart is not completed with payment. So in that sense, since he paid already once to take her out of jail, you don't ask him to do it more. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel come up with a different idea. He said, אם היה פרקונה כנגד כתובתה, פודה, if the ransom was equivalent to her ketubah, so he must ransom her. Ve'im lav, if it is higher, so it's a different story. He doesn't need to do it. Now, in this apparently turn that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel have a contradicting himself, because originally he said that he needs to pay even it's exceeded more than the amount of ketubah. And in this bride he said that he only obligated to pay the amount, the expenses of ketubah, but not exceeded more than that amount. So the Gemara concluded and said, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, trei kulei itle. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel involved with two leniencies in regards to releasing a wife. Number one, he needs to pay only the amount of the going rate. And number two, he does not have the obligation to pay more than the value of ketubah. So it means that the Gemara backed out the original assumption and said that we cannot go by the first writer who tells us that he needs to pay even more than the Ketubah. For example, if the market value exceeded the Ketubah, originally said that he needs to pay, now he said no. And the reason is because in both Braitot, Rabban Shimon Gamliel come and tell us that we have to go lenient, which means that number one is said that further than her value he doesn't need to pay. Second, that if it's exceeded more than the value, he is exempt from paying, and basically he needs to pay the lowest value of both. Lakta chayav lerapota. Here was another painful situation. They married, and now, unfortunately, she have some type of illness. The Ritva said that they use the word lakta. Lakta meaning is stricken with illness. They don't say chalta. So he derived from that there's a difference between if she caused herself to reach that point, or it happens naturally. For example, if she's addicted to alcohol, and they tell her that the liver affected by that, and she's taking all kind of medications, right? And as a result of that, she basically over-exceeded the amount of alcohol, and she hurt herself, right? That's a difference between that versus a naturally turn to be ill. So the Pitche Tshuva in Even HaEzer, Ayin Chet 78, he derived from this view of the Ritva that it's also applied to the amount of pidyon, amount of release. That if she was taken captive because of her fault, for example, trace a situation, they're living in the hand of unpleasant enemies or the hand of other authorities, and she drove a car and she was drunk and she drinking more, and then they stopped her and they take her to captivity, and they're taking off her license, and they capture the car, and they want her to pay X amount of fine, etc., 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 and it's all her fault because she didn't listen to him or to the doctor. Here we reach a point that the husband does not need to pay to release her from the captivity. Or there is another view in Pirkei Tshuva. It says sometimes there's such a hatred between him and her that she does that on purpose. She go before those capture in order to force him to pay for her release. So here you see two avenues of the rabbis who differentiate between manner of illness and captivity. Tanu Rabbanan. Almana nizonet minichsei yatomim. This is a very sensitive subject. You have a ketubah between husband and wife, right? In a ketubah, in a marriage agreement, there are a lot of indirect stipulation. There are conditions. Here you said, you have a widow, and she lost her husband, and the children, the orphans, somehow not get along with her. There can be a lot of scenarios. So here they said she deserved to get something from the property of the husband. So it turns sometimes within the family dynamics so that there is a estate or business, and the children inherited, and then there is a conflict between the inheritors and the widows. So here we said we have to differentiate between healing expenses, medical expenses, and food expenses. So they said, "Utzricha refuah, harei kim zonot." So it means they have to pay for medical expenses. Even it's the same as feeding her. It's considering one of the tnai ketubah, one of the conditions that they have in ketubah. Even you challenge that, but it's basically the one of the stipulation of the bet din. רבן שמעון מגמליאל אומר, רפואה שיש לה קצבה להתרפאת מכתובתה, שאין לה קצבה הרי כמזונות. Here he said you have to differentiate between healing that has a limit and healing that it's not, it's considered just a sustenance. So it means that you have to differentiate between one-time expense over something versus that it's an illness that it's ongoing, and the doctor cannot put a budget of how much is going to be all these expenses. So if it's that case, they cannot go. We cannot go and say to the heirs, to the inheritors, that they commit themselves for everlasting to pay for that expenses. They can reduce the amount, the expenses of the healing, from the amount that he commit himself in the Ketubah, that they are in the future needs to pay her. So the Shita Mekubetzet explain in Rashi too that in general the mindset is you have to have some type of budget frame of expense, because in a way the orphans look at that as they are taking a loss over a estate that they inherited. They not always see it as part of the package, and especially since we have many situations that the wishes is not expressed as clearly, so we have to go by the general framework of Tnai Beit Din. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, עשו הקזת דם בארץ ישראל כרפואה שאין לה קצבה. In those days, they used to do a blooding, taking blood. So that was expenses. So they did it in order to have a good health, etc. in Eretz Israel. So they treated the same as a healing that there's no limit. So there's no limit. They have to pay. The orphan needs to pay. Other countries, they don't have to do it only twice, 3 times a year. So it's something that Shita Mekubetzet explained, that is a רפואה שיש לה קצבה. It's something that we have a clear budget. So it's clear with Rabbi Yochanan, הבו לאיתת אבא, אבא צריכה רפואה כל יום. Unfortunately, a relative of Rabbi Yochanan, they have to take care of the widow from their father, and she needs everyday expenses. You know, nowadays maid, social worker, who knows, medication, etc. Ato lekamei Rabbi Yochanan. So they come and ask for consultant Rabbi Yochanan. Amar lehu, eizilu kotzula mide lerofe. So he said, you know how you circumvent this huge expense? You make a deal, you make a contract with a doctor. What is the budget he agree upon himself in advance? Which means you go to a doctor and you said to him or to her, in our modern days, what do you estimate the expense? And if he said, I don't have an estimate, he says, okay, we're going to hire you for a job to take care of her for the rest of her life. Give us a flat fee, and that's what we want to pay you from now to the end. Every single month, that's the pay. So the Beit Shmuel explained in 79 that it's basically a deal. So the moment you do that, so that's רפואה שיש לה קצבה. Now you have a limit, you have a framework, you know exactly the budget, and therefore, in a sense, that's the heir exempt from doing that. Because as we said, the moment they have a budget, they are out of that. אמר רבי יוחנן, עשינו עצמנו כעורכי הדיינים. We make ourselves like an attorney. What does that mean? So if you remember, we studied in Pirkei Avot, the first chapter, Mishna 8, that you should not be like, what is עורכי דיינים? עורכי דיינים is the people that basically they represent you, and they are basically in your favor. They come with you to court and they convince the judge to go in favor of you. And they basically are such a good in their tongue that they can make the judge, they turn the judge in your favor. So Rabbi Yochanan did something very similar, that he gave them an idea how they will be able to exempt from their obligation to pay that expenses. So that's ke'orche, it's kaf hadimyon. So the Ritva said that the big question is if it's incongruous for Rabbi Yochanan to do it. So there are some said that Ritva said, Balaitu said that it doesn't sound right for us to do that, because without this counsel, so they need to pay that expense. You can show it in a Shulchan Aruch how the halacha is, and they can derive from that, but to direct them in the council, you basically, what you're doing is, you're not only taking sides, you're basically leading them to exempt them from something that may be an obligation for them. So Meikara Maisava. So when this relative of Rabbi Yochanan came and asked him for counsel, what he think, why he thought it is proper for him to give advice and proper for him to do it, Ulveliv Sof Masava, what he thought at the very end of that. So the Gemara said, Meikara Savar Mipsacha Lo Titalem. Originally he thought, Isaiah taught us in his book, chapter 58, verse 7, from you immediate relatives, from you kin, you shall not hide yourself, which means you have the obligation to take care. You have relatives that you want to fight for them, help them, right? But if sof sava, adam chashuv shani. So it means, when you talk about a giant luminary scholar like Rabbi Yochanan, he doesn't sound right even for his own relative to give such a advice, because it doesn't resonate right. I explained, if you remember on page 86, Rashi explained in Klomar why you treated Adam Chashuv in a simple way. There are certain expectations from certain people, and a person in that level, you can't expect president of a company to behave the same as a regular low-level manager, etc. There's a certain expectations from this level. So again, you have the idea that he did what he did, but again, it was challenged somehow. Next Mishnah dealing with the dowry, which means she brought from her father's house sometimes money, sometimes a lot of money, sometimes estate, when they got married. So here you have another phase of stipulation in the Ketubah, that the question is, in general, the husband inherited his wife. So trace the situation, they married not for long, she brought a lot of money as a part of her money of the dowry, and he get it. So the question is how far you go with that. The same applies to the other way. So the moment she passed, he's exempt from the Ketubah and Tosefet Ketubah. So if, for example, a fellow married 2 women and they passed away while he's alive, so he inherited them. So when he will pass away, the same rule is that all of his sons, those from the first wife, those from the second wife, should divide equally the properties. Yes, the sages came in and instituted that the children of each of those women should divide the Ketubah of the mother and the dowry, and only the leftover of the estate, after each of them takes the money that involved with the Ketubah, they should divide it equally. Which means, if you have 2 Ketubot, one involving more money than the others, or if one case there are more sons than the other, so the children will take by the inheritance of the father largest portion by the other wife. That's the way Rashi said. So that's called Ktubat Bnin Dechrin, the Ketubah of the male, the sons. So the Mishnah teaches us, if lo katavla, if the groom did not write for his bride, Bnin Dechrin de'evuli chiminai, a male children that you have as a result of our relations, inun yirtun kesef ktubatech, they inherited the money of the Ketubah, yater al kchul kehon de'im achuhon, in addition to the portion they have with their brothers, which means in addition to a regular portion that they deserve in that Yerusha, and that's inherited, they divided equally with my sons from the other wife. That's the way the Torah teaches us. If it was explicitly said as a Ketubah, chayav, he and obligated, and the sons inheritors the Ketubah of the mother. Why? Shehu tnai bet din, that this is the stipulation of the rabbinic court for all marriages. So you see here that it's not an obligation that comes because of the agreement, the contract between the husband and wife, but is a stipulation that's made by the Supreme Rabbinic Court, and therefore even if this is something that the husband did not commit himself, he's still obligated to do it regardless. So we learn in the early Mishnah, page 49. So one of the conditions of Ketubah is if the husband will passed away while his wife is around, and they have sons and daughters, even by the biblical term, the sons inherited the property of the father, but the sages put a special stipulation in that Ketubah and said that he is obligated to his wife that the daughter from her will live at the same domain and they have part of his property until they reach the age of maturity and got married. Which means, this is something we explained, if you remember, on page 49. So therefore, they said, so the sons, if the husband did not write to his wife in a ketubah, female children that you will bear from me, יהוויין ידבן בביתי ומתזיין מנכסים, shall live in my house and supported by my estate. כל ימי מיגר על מנותך בביתי, as long as you stay in my domain as a widow. So they have meigad, they have meigar, it's different nuschaot. So chayav שהוא תנאי בית דין. He is obligated because that's part of the stipulation of rabbinic court. כך היו אנשי ירושלים כותבים, which means the Meir explained, as long as she, the widows, not get married or she asks for the ketubah, so the heir is obligated to support her. So if the widow not wish to collect the ketubah, the heir cannot force her to take it against her will and exempt themselves from the supports. That's the Meiri said. So שהוא תנאי, וכן אנשי גליל יהיו כותבים כאנשי ירושלים. And also the people of Galilee will write their Ketubot the same as people from Yerushalayim. So the Mishnah meant to say, the Kol Ramaz said that the people of Galilee learn how to write from the people in Yerushalayim. אנשי יהודה היו כותבים עד שירצו היורשים ליתן לך כתובתייך. So they either the chas or kavod or other reason, but basically they wrote that you stay in my domain and you survive, you have the support from my estate until you reach a point that the yoshim, that the heirs wish to give you your כתובה payment, עד שירצו יורשים ניתן לה כתובתייך, לפיכך, and therefore, אם רצו יורשים נותנים לה כתובתה ופוטרים אותה. If the inheritors wish to give her, they give her the money of the ketubah, even against her will, and they're no longer obligated. They can discharge their obligation to her. She can send away. The Shita Mekubetz challenged that, but basically the idea is that that's the minhag of the Yehuda. Anyway, the Meiri also go along with this. Now the Gemara dealing with the source. Since we said that in the first stipulation you have mentioned the Mishnah is Ketubat B'din Dechrim, Ketubah of the male children. So the Gemara said, אמר רבי יוחנן משום רבי שמעון בן יוחאי מפני מה התקינו כתובת בנין דחרין. So biblically speaking, the husband inherited his wife, and when the husband passed to the father, so everyone, the sons of the first wife together with the one of the second wife, they divided the property equally. אמר רבי יוחנן משום רבי שמעון בן יוחאי, that the husband inherited his wife, and when the father passed, all of his sons, those from the first one together with those from the second one, divided equally all of his estate. So מפני מה התקינו כתובת בנין דיכרין? So what's the reason the sages put the institute the Ketubah of the male children? So meaning, why did the sages not institute that the father should inherit to his sons the Ketubah of the mother and her dowry that he inherited from her, and not divided that equally with other sons from the other wives? So Rabbi Yochanan said the reason for that is כדי שיקפוץ אדם ויכתוב לביתו כבנו, in order for a person to write a large dowry for his daughter as he will do it for his son. So meaning before the institution of Ketubah for the children, so a father basically will not give such a big nedunya, big sum of dowry to the daughters, because if the daughter preceded the husband, if she passed away before the husband, remember we studied that Rabbeinu Tam and Tosfot, so they later they remarried, and the dowry will be inherited not only by the daughter's sons, but also by any sons from the second marriage. So imagine the father, he saved every penny all this time and all these properties, it's now outside of his control, outside of the family. So the rabbis came in and put an enchantment to ensure that the father property will be inherited only by his daughter's sons, who are his own descendants. This is something that we learned earlier, and the Rabbeinu Matitya Gaon and the Rosh and others that said that that's the minhag nowadays, to have a large dowry, so you don't need it. It's a big discussion. Tosfot and others, this discussion how far you go only by the movable object, by immovable object or movable object, etc. Anyway, the key is that he should give a nice size of dowry to his daughter. So the Gemara said, that it means to say that the Torah is full of compassion, right? That the sons inherited the property of the father and not the daughter. Remember, the Torah said in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 27, verse 28, verse 8, it said that if a person passed away and there is no son, so the Torah said you should transfer the estate to his daughter, which means, Rashi said that if he does have son, the son deserves the inheritance. So they said, Ve'atu Rabbanan, and the sages come in, umetakne de teirut brata. So the rabbis came in and said that some of the estate go to the daughter. So since that money of the dowry, it was befitting to fall to his, after his passing, to his sons, which means when he gave it to his daughter, he's basically taking away something from the Yerusha, from the inheritance of the sons. So that's the idea. Even it's, the Meiri explained, it's kind of incongruous to do it. It's basically, that's the whole idea of hafka'ah, taking away the Yerusha. So the Gemara said, ha-name, deoraita. This idea of obligation to take this dowry is also from the Torah, it's a biblical. And if you remember, that's something that we learn it in more divrei Kabbalah, in more something like a tradition that we receive. The rabbi said that's the Ritva and the Rama and others that said that it's not directly the Torah, it's kind of divrei Kabbalah. It's a more tradition that we receive from our early prophet, from our teachers. The source is the Chtiv. They said in Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 6, K'hu Nashim, take wives, ve'holidu banim uvanot, and have and beget sons and daughters, uk'hu livneichem nashim, and take wives for your sons, ve'ed bnoteichem tnu la'nashim, and give your daughters to husbands. So it means that a person have the obligation to marry his son and his daughter. So the Gemara asks, Bishlama banim bidei kaimei. If you understand that the father being charged to marry off his sons because it's in his control, because usually men he try to chase women, right? Ela bnatei mi kaiman bidei. But the daughters, it's in his control. Women, at least in those days, not run and chase men, right? You know, in Isaiah chapter 4, they said about the end of the days, you know that quote. So anyway, here we talk about that time that it's the old-fashioned, that men chasing women. Hakamash melan, we derive from that, the nilbesha v'nechasa v'neitiv la midei, that the father will in charge of all the clothing, nice clothing, nice, how do you say it, a cosmetic or nice clothes, and give us some of the property. So that more men will be interested. As you know, there are some men that declares that they want just because they want them. But the reality of life, sometimes men have other motivations. He wants money or beauty or connections, so who knows? There's others. So this is a fulfillment. He give the nice size dowry to his daughter. So hopefully you reach a befitting husband for her. The Meiri explained based on the Gemara in Kiddushin, page 33b, that's increase her value in our simple language. Ve'ad kama. So you tell me how far the father is obligated to give some size of his estate to this daughter if he cannot find a normal man to marry her. And he knew, okay, in order for me to find her top boy, how do you say it here? Top Yeshiva University boy or whatever, type Yeshiva Chaim Berlin boy or something that it's a very high quality son-in-law. How much he needs to add more than the dowry. So he said, Abaye ve'Ravad, Amrit Ravayu, ad le'isur nichsei, up to 10% of his estate. That's the obligation, how far you go with this. So the Gemara said, okay, since we talk about Ketubat din dechrin ve'eima de'av, which means the father of the mother that gives the mother the Ketubah, leirut, the sons were inherited, but the Ketubah and the Tosefet Ketubah, the Baal, that the husband committed from himself, lo leirut, he doesn't need to inherit it, to give. So they said, guess what? Im ken, if you do that, if it were so that the sons will not inherit the rest of the Ketubah, guess what? Av name mimna velo katav. The father will be also, he will abstain and not try the dowry for his daughter. and and then it's a problem, right? He says that because this guy is so with money, he's not giving to the sons of my daughter, so I'll stop and reduce the amount of the dowry. So the essence of this, the rabbinic decree is no longer in effect. So therefore the rabbis came in and they instituted that the sons inherited even the money of the Ketubah that their husband wrote, in addition to the money of the dowry that the mother brought from her father's house. If the father writes the dowry to his daughter, lichtov baal, the husband should write in a Ketubah the obligation to inherit the Ketubah nindechin. Heicha de lo katav av, if he doesn't write the dowry to his daughter, lo lichtov baal, so the husband is not obligated, he should not have to write the stipulation giving the male children the Ketubah. Why? Because the essence of that rabbinic decree, it's in order for a person to be not only sympathetic but wish to give a dowry to his daughter. So you may say that the husband doesn't have the same obligation only if the father did it to his daughter. So the Gemara said, Lo palug rabanan. The sages did not distinguish when you have this type of law, and they said, and therefore, since most of the Ketubot they involve with dowry, so the rabbis did not differentiate between each Ketubah and put that stipulation in all of them. So now the Gemara asks a question. But ben abanim name teirut, a daughter among sons from another marriage should also inherit the Ketubah of her mother. So why the sages differentiate between that in this decree between the sons and daughters? So they said kenachala shaviu rabbanan. The sages took this stipulation as inherited, as a property. So consequently, when you have a daughter among sons, she cannot benefit from that one. So they said, but ben abanot teirot. So if you have a daughter among only daughters from another marriage, should inherit her mother Ketubah, since the deceased father has no sons. So they said, lo palug rabanan. The sages did not distinguish when enchanting this law. So the daughter never inherit her mother's Ketubah. So they said, v'tikbem mi metal telei. They collected from movable object. So if the whole purpose is in order for the father to give a dowry to his daughter, so the same applies to his sons that should collect the Ketubah for the mother, even from a movable object, the same as they collected from a real estate, from an immovable object. And if you remember on page 50b, we learn that Ketubah bnin dechrin were not collected only from real estate, from immovable object. So what's the reason for that differentiation? So they said, Ketubah shaviu rabbanan. The sages made the male children stipulation like the Ketubah itself, which is collected only from a real property. So they said, if that's the case, titrof mimesha abdei. So the male children should seize the mother Ketubah from sold real properties. The same from the real property in the possession of the father upon his death. So they said yirtun tnan. The Mishna used the word the sons inherited the mother Ketubah. So the heirs do not inherit property that the father had sold. Another question in regards to Ketubah bin Dechin, we learned the Mishnah in page 91. It's a fellow that married two wives, and they passed while he is alive, and then he passed, and the children from each and every one of those two wives came to collect the amount of the Ketubah of their mothers. So the real halacha is that only after they take each of them, then if anything left more than the dinar's value, so they take the amount of Ketubah. But if it's less than dinar, they cannot collect the money of Ketubah, but they divided equally for the whole estate of the father. So the Gemara asks, Ve'ema, Afal gav deleika motar dinar. So it goes the idea that the person should leave some dowry to his daughter. So what's the difference if it's dinar left or not? So the Gemara said the din Torah is that all the sons equally divided, excluding the firstborn, that take double. So now the Gemara said, Bimkom dekam me'ikara nachala deoraita, in a situation where the biblical inheritance will be uprooted by the rabbinic inheritance. Lo takun Rabbanan, the sages did not institute their inheritance. So only if you have in a property at least the value of dinar, then you go that way. But if not, then this decree is no longer in effect. Now we have a story that involved with this male children situation, which in Mitzvah Shem we're going to study tomorrow.